I read your book, and it was very, very helpful.
Thank
and
you.
I even brought it to my therapy sessions with my therapist. They had all these things
Wow.
bookmarked in there
Wow.
that I could relate to, because I'm a checker too, but I check different things than you check. One of the things is doorknobs and ovens, but then there's other things that, like if I have an itch, I'll scratch it over and over to make sure I got it correctly. I think, what if I didn't get the itch? It was like 4 years ago. I had like an itch on my eyelid, and I kept rubbing it over and over to make sure I got it. They're like thinking, what if the itch doesn't go away? Can you explain like what some of your checking things were?
Sure. My underlying obsession over the years has been, what if I unknowingly harm somebody in the past? And I've developed a series of compulsions around that obsession that were simply ways of trying to convince myself that I hadn't harmed somebody. And so I obsessed about whether or not I was inadvertently running people over with my car. And I developed a whole series of compulsions where I had to drive my car in circles to go back and check anytime that there was a bump in the road that rattled the car. I'd have to check the car bumper to bumper when I got back to make sure that there weren't any signs of an accident. I would check police reports. I work in the news industry, which is kind of ironic because I report on people being in accidents all the time. And so I would check my own news sources to make sure that there wasn't a report of me having harmed somebody and not known about it. So there was a whole series of compulsions around driving. I became very concerned that I might unknowingly be carrying germs that I could be infecting other people with, horrible diseases I might unknowingly have. And so I became a washer, but not to protect my own self, but rather to protect the rest of the world from me. And so anytime I was in public and would have interactions with other people, I would have to scrub my hands before meeting them to make sure that my hands were clean enough that I wouldn't be causing harm to people around me. And again, there was a great irony there because I was in a fairly public position and I would meet a lot of people, and I would become very afraid that I was going to contaminate them. Beyond that, the title of my book, Rewind, Replay, Repeat, is a reference to the fact that I do a lot of mental checking and reviewing things in my head. And that could be anything from a conversation I had to various sequences of my day, lane changes in the car, any of that. After I had exhausted my physical checking, I would start doing the mental checking. And I would just replay sequences in my head over and over again. And in every single one of these cases, it was always about trying to remove the uncertainty, which is, of course, at the core of OCD. Beyond that, I also did a lot of confessing, compulsive confessing. Wanted to make sure that people knew that I might be responsible for some kind of horrific act, and reassurance seeking. I did a lot of that in terms of just pulling my wife into the mix and calling her 10, 15 times a day to make sure that I hadn't done this or that, or that I did do this or that. And beyond that, the biggest hindrance for me was the avoidance. Before I got therapy and in the early phases of therapy, when I was just really struggling with the disorder, I found that it was easier for me just to avoid situations completely. If I were in your shoes, for example, and it was going to be a trigger to be here, I simply wouldn't have come. And that's why I say I find it so courageous that you're doing this, because avoidance, I believe, is the ultimate compulsion. And I had to learn that the hard way, because for me, for so long, that just seemed like a good coping strategy. Well, if I'm going to get triggered by this, just don't do it. So I gave up driving, for example. And then the irony there is that walking became a great issue for me, because I thought, well, if I can't trust myself to drive, I'm just going to stop driving. But then I started walking places, and I noticed all the rocks and twigs on sidewalks, and decided that it was my responsibility to make sure that nobody got hurt on those sidewalks. So I'd have to pick up every rock and every twig and every piece of glass. And that became very much a compulsive ritual. So I started learning that you really can't address OCD by just avoiding
Right.
those things that set you off.
Right. With social anxiety disorder, yeah, I like to avoid large social situations. I feel more comfortable when I'm in groups of like maybe 3 or 4 people. But beyond that, it gets real nerve-wracking,
Yeah.
and I try to avoid it. And coming here is like 1,000 people here, and I don't know anybody except through emails.
Yep.
And like this is a huge exposure
Yep.
for social anxiety
No,
for me.
I believe it. I absolutely believe it. Which is, again, why I really admire you're doing this, because it would be really easy just to say, that's too hard, I'm not going to do it.
Yeah,
But
it
that
sure would
only-
be easier to walk away,
Absolutely.
and I've learned so much from this conference.
Oh, there's so much to learn.
Yeah.
So many heroic people walking around here.
I know. And I'm writing my memoir right now too.
Excellent.
And how did, when you wrote your memoir, how did that improve your OCD? Because I remember you were like lying on your backyard hammock staring up at the stars, and you
Yep.
said to yourself, show me how to turn this crazy life around, and I'll share my story with anyone who will listen. How did that change your life?
It changed everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's influenced everything that I do in the OCD community, which is primarily these days around motivation. As you know, living with OCD and getting treated for OCD are very difficult endeavors. As you just discussed, it's really difficult for you to come here. That's exposure. What I found was, even though I got the right tools, I was fortunate to stumble across the right diagnosis. I was misdiagnosed a couple of times, but I got in the right place, and I started getting help, and I started getting better, but not as better as I wanted to be. And I became bitter about that, and I just figured maybe I didn't have the right therapist or the right medication or the right combination. And what I slowly came to accept was that what was missing was my ability to really pour myself into the process, to really give my all to exposure therapy. And what I found the missing ingredient was motivation.
Mm-hmm.
I just wasn't motivated enough to do that. And so the scene you're describing there in the backyard where I made this bargain with the universe, it was really just my coming to terms with the fact that I was ready to do what it took to get better. And what I did in that moment was I decided that I was going to share my story in a constructive way. And the irony there was I didn't have a success story to share. And I told myself I was going to share a success story, not just my story, but a success story. And what I did is I kind of put the proverbial cart before the horse and said, okay, I'm going to write a book about getting better from OCD. But for that to happen, I need to get better from OCD. And it became this great motivator for me. And I didn't understand a lot of this at the time, but what I've come to understand with hindsight is that I identified what I've come to call a greater good motivator. And for me, greater good motivation is something that allows me to be of service to other people and or empower myself by increasing my sense of purpose. So this book project was both. It allowed me to do something for people other than myself, and it allowed me to enhance my sense of purpose by saying, maybe there's a reason I'm going through everything I'm going through, and this is a way that I can shift who I am from a person with OCD to an author and advocate on behalf of OCD. And it was a really, really powerful shift. And it didn't happen overnight in terms of, it took me 9 years to write this book and rewrite it, rewrite it. But along the way, I had that carrot in front of me, that greater good motivator, which was that I was going to be able to do something for other people in a constructive way, and I was going to be able to reframe who I am in a more positive way. And I've come to look at those two sides of what I call the empowerment coin as purpose and service. And I started learning that purpose and service are incredibly powerful motivators. And I became fascinated with that whole topic and researched a second book that I wrote, When in Doubt, Make Belief. And in the process of researching that, I learned that there's all this empirical research that supports this notion of what I learned experientially. And then there's this whole body of research that's emerging these days about the power of altruism and the power of purpose. And that really is what propels me in terms of motivation.
I noticed in the book, too, there were references to AA in there.
Yep.
And I've been going to AA since 1995, and I've been sober since then.
Excellent.
Too.
AA is a wonderful model, and I draw a lot from that. I haven't been through the formal 12-step program, but I've read about it a lot. And I think that that concept of again, helping ourselves by helping other people is really powerful. And one of the things that I've learned within the OCD community is that Michael Janicki, who of course is one of the gurus of the OCD world in terms of treatment, told me that in all of his years, and we're talking about 30 years or so of treating people with OCD, the best indicator of their potential success is the degree to which they are willing and able to reach out to other people and help them. And you see it everywhere at a conference like this. You know, people are doing that and they're benefiting from it. And I believe that you're benefiting from it right now as well.
I remember in the book you said your dad's a perfectionist, and my dad is too. And when I read that in your book, I thought, oh my God, I could really relate to that.
You know, it's interesting because, as you read in the book, I spent a lot of years blaming my father for my OCD. And I've come to learn that, from my understanding of the science, I'm not a scientist, but that you really can't, someone can't give you OCD per se. I mean, having a perfectionist father or living in a situation where there's a lot of control and whatnot, I think these things can exacerbate the problem that we might have biologically or genetically, but they didn't cause it. And so a big part of my journey, as I tried to share in the book, was coming to understand that it wasn't my dad's fault. He certainly exacerbated the problem, and to his credit, he was very encouraging about my sharing our family story very openly, because he said, you know, if I can help other families realize that perfectionism can really, again, complicate, exacerbate an existing problem, then that's something that needs to be out there. So I do tend to find that a lot of people with OCD have grown up in those kinds of environments.
Yeah.
And my own thinking is that it's not so much that they developed OCD because of that, it's just that their OCD became so pronounced that they were genetically predisposed to have it, but that it became pronounced because of that environment.
And how did the 12 steps of AA help you with?
Yeah, there were a lot of things that came out of that were really helpful for me. One was just the notion of surrendering to a higher power. That really resonated with me, because I had not grown up in a religious environment and still don't consider myself a religious person, but very much a spiritual person. And that whole very broad language of AA about a higher power and surrendering to a higher power was very powerful for me. Also, the whole notion of accepting what we can't control. And with OCD, that's such a tricky one, because when we break it down, obsessions and compulsions, we can control our compulsions. We can choose not to do them, but we can't choose not to have the obsessions. And as you know, the worst thing we can do is say, I'm not going to think about that. I mean, that's a trap. And so that becomes tricky. That whole idea of surrender becomes very tricky with OCD. And it was helpful for me to start teasing out what I should surrender and what I shouldn't surrender. And then, just the whole idea that, again, we help ourselves by reaching out and helping others. And that was a really powerful model for me. The trap for me, and I'm sure you can relate to some of this as well, was the whole making amends step.
I remember that.
Yeah, because for me, that became another compulsion.
Yeah.
I wanted to not only confess to people that I had, done X, Y, and Z, but I also wanted to go back and fix everything. And today, I really work with this greater good framework that I was sharing with you, and try to remind myself that there are times when my making amends for something I've done in the past is really almost a selfish thing for me to do, because it might get in the way of that other person's current life. Now, that's not to say that AA's version of making amends isn't the right one. I believe it is in that situation, but for those of us with OCD, we can take that off the charts.
Yeah.
and that I'm not the only one that I've run across in the community that's had a problem with that, where they became, compulsive about trying to, apologize for every slight or every, harmful comment or every small whatever over the years, and that became an issue. But it wasn't enough of an issue that it chased me away from that AA model, but it was something that was, a challenge for me along.
But when I first quit drinking, I had to quit drinking a certain way. I developed the ritual for quitting drinking, and I had to do it the right way, because I thought to myself, because I can relate to what you say about harming other people. I thought to myself, okay, I drank a 6-pack of beer last night. What if I can't remember everything I did?
Sure.
And what if I hurt somebody?
Right.
So I thought to myself, okay, well, in order to jar my memory, I'll drink another 6-pack of beer. and
that logic's a little flawed. But
I know. And then I thought to myself, and then the next night I'll drink 5, and the next night I'll drink 4, and the next night I'll drink 3, and that'll jar my memory. So I did it like that, and I got down to 3, and all of a sudden I thought to myself, damn it, I didn't do it right. I got to do it all over again now. And instead of doing it all over again, I called my sponsor and I told him about my obsessive compulsive disorder and how I wanted to quit drinking, and it was interfering with my drinking. I had to do it a certain way. So he said to me, okay, come on over and we'll talk about it. And we talked about it for like 2 hours. And after that 2 hours, I didn't have the compulsion to quit drinking a certain way. And I know that sounds really crazy that I had to.
I understand it.
And I realized at that moment, talking to somebody about my compulsions relieves my compulsions. It also relieves my desire to want to drink too. And that was the first time I had ever spoken with somebody outside of my family or therapy about my OCD. And in your book too, I remember you went to that retreat in Kansas City, and that was the first time you had spoken to a woman named Kathleen.
Mm-hmm. Wow, you did take good notes in the book. Yeah, that was a really powerful moment talking to Kathleen.
Yeah,
first time.
Can you explain about
Sure.
that?
Yeah, it was the first time that I was able to say it out loud to somebody, it being that I have OCD, to somebody who I didn't know and trust. And it was a really amazing moment. And Kathleen and I have been friends ever since. We're still in contact. And I think it was powerful for her too, because I trusted her with that information. I mean, as you know, OCD is not only debilitating, but shame-producing. And I think a lot of us get so consumed by the stigma around what we're dealing with that we bottle it up and we don't share. And it's very freeing, I think, to be able to, say to somebody, I have OCD. And for me, that was a turning point, because I realized if I could do it with Kathleen, share that aspect of who I am, then I could share it with other people. And that was the first step, I think, in going public. I mean, by the time it got to the stage of publishing a book, then anybody who wanted to buy a book could know my story. But that was the starting point. I mean, it was just one person that I was willing to trust, and that held my trust, and put me on the right path to sharing.
I used to go to my mom all the time for reassurance. She would reassure me. One reassurance was never enough. It was always a variation on it. Like an hour later, it's like, oh, there's a new variation on my question now. And it's just a never-ending...
It's a form of checking.
Yeah,
There's no question
exactly.
about it. It's a checking compulsion. Yeah, I mean, in fact, I don't know about you, but I got pretty good at trying to get reassurance from my therapist.
Yeah, me too.
And, there came a time where she said, no, wait a minute, you're just coming here for me to tell you everything's going to be okay. That's not effective. For me, even more than the personality match of the therapist, it was finding somebody who had that expertise. And the first therapist that I saw, Dr. X, was a traditional psychotherapist, and I really didn't give him much of a chance to do anything because I held so much back because of stigma. The second therapist, Dr. Y, was very much a traditional psychotherapist who really brought everything back, as you recall from the book, to how does that make you feel? Which is a fine question, and there's nothing wrong with psychotherapy, but what we know from a scientific standpoint in the OCD community is that this disorder does not respond to psychotherapy. It responds to cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's a difference. And really, it's a critical distinction because for somebody battling obsessions and compulsions, you really need that kind of focused therapy that has been proven to work. And Dr. Y did not recognize the OCD, and because she didn't, she was unable to point me to the right kind of treatment. So, like you, I was spending my own money out of pocket for that therapy because I didn't want to leave a paper trail. That was the big thing for me, is I was afraid of what would happen if I put it through my insurance company. And so I spent a lot of money, and then I became kind of bitter because I knew I wasn't getting better. And when I finally stumbled across my diagnosis in a book, I knew immediately that OCD was the right label for me because I fit to a T the person I was reading about in The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing. And when I went back and told Dr. Y about that, she had never heard of OCD. And, you know, that was 16, 17 years ago. And yet, I hear from people today that that still happens. And so one of my real commitments in the OCD advocacy world is helping the OCD community make the non-OCD professional community aware of OCD. And so for me, it was really about finding somebody who understood my particular challenge and understood the treatment process for it. And that's when things started really changing for me, was when I found Jackie, and she fit that bill.
I also like what you said in the book. An alcoholic is only one drink away from his alcoholism, just like I'm one OCD episode away from my own personal hell, because I can really relate to that. Because if I give in to my OCD for just more than a few seconds, it's like just like a snowball. I got to stop it fast. And
thank you for that feedback, because unlike you, I have not had to battle the addiction of alcohol that you have, and so it sounds like you agree with that
Definitely,
model.
yeah.
I mean, I can only speculate as to what it's like for somebody battling an addiction or alcoholism, and yet, from everything I've read, it really is that same phenomenon, in that, you know, take a drink and it's really, really hard to stop drinking. Indulge your OCD, and it's really hard to start snapping out of it. And I think at some point that actually worked in my favor, because even when I was in a bad place and really wanted to do my compulsion, there was a part of me that realized that, okay, yeah, I can do it, and it's going to give me some temporary relief. But you know what? Historically speaking, it's going to mean I'm going to open up a whole can of worms that I'm going to be dealing with for a long time. And so at some very practical level, that actually worked in my favor.
Because I read something like about the one second rule when you get an obsession, and you had to let it last any more than 1 second. Just think of it like as a passing cloud.
Exactly.
And that's what I try to do these days.
I find that analogy to be really helpful because, again, you and I both know it's not helpful to say, I'm not going to think about that. That only gives it more value and power, and you know, it backfires. But the passing cloud analogy has worked very well for me over the years. It's just say, okay, I see it, I acknowledge it, but I'm going to let it pass by. And that was a real breakthrough for me, that whole concept of just acknowledging it, observing it, but not necessarily fixating on it. And there's a difference. And that's one of those subtle differences where again, we can't choose not to have a thought. We can choose not to fixate on it. And for me, that was a big breakthrough, was coming to to understand that distinction.
I really like what A2A is doing, and I want to get involved with it. I know it will help me as well as help others. And can you explain about the A2A?
Absolutely, and thank you for asking. And you absolutely represent what we're about, what you're doing with this project. As I said, the more I did my advocacy through writing the book and then getting out and talking about it and then becoming a spokesperson for the OCD Foundation and speaking on their behalf, the better I got. And I became fascinated with that, and even more by the fact that through advocacy I started meeting and networking with all these amazing individuals like yourself who are finding the very same thing to be true. And I thought, well, there's got to be something to that. I mean, that's pretty fascinating that we're all finding that we help ourselves by helping others. And I also came to learn that it was not just about OCD or even mental health issues, that people I was meeting that had cancer were finding the same thing. A young man I met with ALS was finding that same phenomenon. And I started researching the concept for my second book. And that's when I became first aware of some of this empirical research that's out there that supports the whole science of service and the science of meaning. And I became very fascinated with that, wrote the second book, and realized that there was something I wanted to do with this concept, and I really didn't know what. And I realized what I most wanted to do was to network people who were in the same boat as I am, in terms of, I call people like you and me, Ken, adversity-driven advocates. We're advocates, and we're doing what we're doing because we're driven by the adversity that we've been through. And I said, well, what if we just build a little network of adversity-driven advocates? And we made one of our missions to be supporting people like you and others who are writing books and doing films, and even something as small as just writing a blog or a newsletter, anything that they're doing that's advocacy. And I know that there's strength in numbers, and because I come out of the media world, I realized that we could help individuals leverage the media coverage that they were getting by showcasing their stories. And so we set out to do something very small scale. I had no idea what it was going to look like. A year and a half later, the organization has grown to 30 people, all volunteer, who are working on building this out. We started with 5 Alliance members, people who are adversity-driven advocates. We're up to 20, and we're on track for growing our network to about 100 this year. And these are all individuals that we are actively working with to promote their work. And that was the first level of A2A. And the second part was, well, what can we do to help others step into advocacy? You and I are already doing this advocacy, but I know it wasn't easy for either one of us to step into it.
Right.
And so what could we do for those folks? And so we decided that we wanted to start building paths to advocacy. And one of those programs, for example, is the Messages of Hope campaign. And that is an opportunity for somebody who perhaps has never done advocacy before to step into it, taste it, see how it feels. And we do that in a number of ways. On our website, people can leave an anonymous message. So if they're not ready to go public, they can leave a message for somebody in their own community that might say something to the fact of, you know, I've had OCD all my life, but I've got treatment, or I got treatment and I've gotten better, and I know that there is hope for people with OCD. And that's a really powerful way for them to not only share encouragement that other people will benefit from, but to taste what it feels like to do something constructive with their own adversity. And so that's where we've gone with the project. We're an online website that's, or I should say a website-based project that just aims to network individuals doing adversity-driven advocacy and provide paths to advocacy for people who are new to it. Excellent. Well, that was a pleasure. You so did your homework. I will tell.
It was a really good book.
Well, thank you. Well, I will tell you though, as a guy who does a lot of interviewing for a living, it's always refreshing to, when I'm on the other side of the microphone, to be working with somebody who knows the subject matter, and I appreciate that very much.
Thank you.